Good evening, and welcome to the Jeanie Graustein Lecture in Environmental Justice. Jeanie was a longtime member of the STM community and a graduate of Yale Divinity School. She also worked for the Office of Social Justice Ministry for the Archdiocese of Hartford, living out her passion for care of creation. Molly Burhans, a recent graduate of the Yale School of the Environment, then the School of Forestry, is an internationally recognized leader in cartography, social entrepreneurship, conservation, and innovative strategies for faith-based, impact-driven property use and management. She is the Executive Director and founder of GoodLands, a social enterprise that assists Catholic communities around the world to realize the potential of their property to support missions in environmental and social justice, while also improving their financial management. GoodLands digitizes the map records, including land records, to lay a foundation for evidence-based, community-grounded, design-driven land use. Their initiatives include the architecting and implementing of the Catholic geospatial infrastructure, which supports open access to over 300 datasets, apps, and maps that GoodLands has curated. Other significant projects are global mapping of the Vincentian family, the Global Catholic Carbon Footprint, a global biodiversity assessment of the Catholic Church, a green infrastructure assessment of all Catholic-affiliated properties in the USCCB, a map of Catholic communications infrastructure throughout Africa, and the Dicastery of Communications, global and historical mapping of Catholic healthcare and childcare infrastructure, and a variety of other GIS-related projects for dioceses and organizations. Molly's vision and solutions for realizing the potential of real estate portfolios as powerful leverage points for change include helping to ground Catholic social teaching and the vision of Laudato Si and the way we use our land have been shared widely. Following her talk, there will be some time for some questions, so students please come right up to the microphone afterwards. Please help me to welcome Molly as she addresses the topic, Making Land Work for Good, Property as a Powerful Force for Change.
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. Can you hear me? Great. So I'm just going to get started with a slideshow because my work is very visual. So can everyone see this? Okay. And digitally? Is this good? Fantastic. So I'm Molly Burhans. I'm the founder of GoodLands, and this is a polygon. It delineates all of the different landforms, hydrology, geology, development patterns, species habitats, people, where they are, and ecosystems within the Potomac River watershed. And this is a line. It illustrates the boundary between Turkey and Syria. And are there any bird nerds in the audience who might guess what these are? These are migratory flyways for the world. A map is one of the most powerful tools that we have for understanding our environment and shaping it through blueprints that we create to form the future. Maps are used by governments, NGOs, businesses around the world to inform their operations. And for the first time in history, back in 2016, me and a pretty significant team set out to understand the world in an entirely new way, but I thought this must already exist. So we'll get into this very interesting story about how we got there and how it relates to climate change. But we understood the world from a geo-religious perspective for the first time in history for any major world religion. When I say this, I mean instead of statistics about Catholics or any major world religion confined to the boundaries of, say, geopolitical countries, nations, or even other kind of subnational groupings, we used a religion's own geography. We made the first global map of the Catholic Church in history. So just a couple terms about kind of church functions. for everyone that doesn't spend their life mapping ecclesiastical jurisdictions and such, says these are kind of administrative one boundaries, what we call bishops' conferences or episcopal conferences within the Catholic Church, so like the US Conference of Catholic Bishops. One layer down, there are provinces. So ecclesiastical provinces, unlike episcopal conferences or dioceses, do not contiguously cover the surface of the earth, because you need at least one archdiocese and one kind of ordinary diocese to make up at least a province. And you can see the darker black areas are where there's a kind of holy see there. And the level below that is what I refer to as dioceses. Generally, this kind of admin 3 level is like counties here. And there's a lot of different types of dioceses. So the red here is regular dioceses, the blue is archdioceses, there's apostolic vicariates, and other types of mission territories. Why this matters, partially, for our future is land and religion. When we look back in history, are 2 of the most powerful leverage points for change, for moving our civilization forward. They're also really, I would say, 2 points that have caused a lot of conflict in human history too. So there's a lot of potential and there's a lot of need for intelligent and respectful work in this space. About 8% of the Earth's habitable surface is owned by faith-based institutions, and 5% of commercial forests. That's larger than the size of India and Sudan combined. If we think about this, what this means is if we don't pull it together with our own communities and institutions as faith groups to move forward the vision of Laudato Si and address climate change, we aren't going to do it in time. A little bit about Catholics around the world. If you aren't familiar with this, there's about 1.2 billion of us, so we make up approximately 16% of the global population. About 26% of healthcare facilities around the world are run by Catholic institutions affiliated with religious orders, comprising the largest network of healthcare. 54 million students, last time I checked, are educated under Catholic education, the largest non-governmental network of education in the world as well. And Catholic humanitarian aid comprises the 2nd largest network of humanitarian aid globally, if you include all member organizations under the United Nations. And not surprisingly, under all these kind of different institutions, whether dioceses or religious orders, we oversee a lot of land. This is a map of Catholic properties within the United States that was made back in 2017, was the last update for this one, and sadly, the newer ones are much more sparse. When I was in graduate school, I thought, gosh, this is so interesting, and I was studying ecological design, and I set out to find the people doing this work. I'd originally been discerning vocations, and I had co-founded my first company, which is a worker-owned cooperative, so the workers own all the shares, and it's an indoor vertical farm. It's still operating in Buffalo. And I had gone down this amazing kind of journey of regenerative agriculture through that process and sustainable business. And I thought, gosh, I mean, someone must be helping people with all this land, right? Or at least maybe there's the largest network of conservation the world has ever seen. I'm just not searching right or something. And after a couple years, when Laudato Si came out, I decided to boldly step into this massive void of work, assuming, to be honest, not that I was very brave or intelligent remarkably to move this forward, but really that planet's on fire and no one was doing this, and I must just be really bad at searching because this is so obvious it must be happening. So I founded GoodLands back in 2015. There's a lot of research and work going into it before, though. I knew that to bring a paradigm of ecological design to a parish was critical, that when we look out at our landscapes, there's so much potential to help our communities, our finances, and also our faith. For example, in this plan, we can see different ways for community engagement, such as the trail loop, supporting the economic functions of the site through flexible lot. Parking is a huge issue. Kara just actually released a really interesting report about the issue of parking and for parishes in many parts of the southwestern United States. Solar energy can help reduce costs over time. Green roofs can reduce cooling and heat. Even tree planting can, when done strategically, cut heating costs by 20 to 40% over time. There's communal space, so bringing people back to the parish, really grounding it as a site for community, which St. Thomas More does so well here for all of you at Yale. If we could imagine this being something that more parishes engaged in, providing recreational space, even allotments, and further ecological, habitats, stormwater management, reforestation, all of this can help support ecosystems functions and provide a site that's more enjoyable. But the problem I ran into was doing a site scale plan is really not economic for most parishes or organizations. It's about $50,000 to $100,000 for a single site just for the plan, minimum. And I knew that we needed to scale this somehow to all this property we had. So we ended up creating a classification system based on all the Catholic land that we've mapped so far, and it's built with machine learning, so it continuously updates and helps us optimize where to place ecology and food security solutions and migration and relief. That allows us to look at a whole property portfolio at once and show where to put the programs that are going to make the most difference. And further, looking out to a global scale enables us to bring this around the world. So what does around the world mean, and why go so big? Well, once again, I assumed that we must have a global map of dioceses. And what I found was that if we did one project in a diocese, such as stormwater management optimization and financial planning, and a diocese with a similar kind of classification system that we built, it would reduce the cost tremendously to scale this. Without that, this would be really unaffordable and unmanageable for most dioceses, not only around the world, but in the United States. So I'm not gonna, this is like really nerdy, so I'm not gonna dive into this too much, but basically we created a classification system for dioceses that includes information like geopolitical security and stability, even disease, with predictive models that a group that was affiliated with Georgetown and a number of other institutions, including Harvard, actually built out. This allows us to really kind of just take this globally and ensure that in the very limited time we have at this point to make any difference, to make a habitable planet, we have a chance. So the first step was finding the land records, right? And then also finding the diocesan boundaries. Here. There should be a movie playing. So I'll just show you this slide. So, you know, I started calling bishops actually before GoodLands even had a name, writing to dioceses. What I learned was that this was a huge issue. It wasn't even just that we didn't have any property records that were paper. They were all distributed all over dioceses, in file cabinets, in basements, in back rooms. There was no consolidated office in most dioceses. They even had an Excel spreadsheet when I began this. This is a huge undertaking. Thankfully, I had one of my board members actually helped Boston Archdiocese with their housing for a number of years, so we kind of commiserated, and it really hadn't been updated since he was there. Eventually, I found myself looking for that global map of dioceses after working with students at Yale for about a year. It was the spring of 2016, and so I was 26 years old, or 25 years old, and we had been looking all over because for student projects, we couldn't do this kind of novel work directly with the diocese as we were learning due to just quality control. So we had to, you know, do research projects. And I thought, gosh, there must be a diocese map in the Vatican. And this would be great for everyone to work with. I'm not a graduate of the Yale School of the Environment. Actually, I want to correct that really fast. But I have worked with students there for more than half a decade now, and they're all fantastic. So when I was 26, I'd made a kind of graphic prototype of these jurisdictional boundaries. And I brought it to CRS, and I was invited to present it at a conference in Kenya. And then I took my free flight. I found a GoodLands with $7,000. And this is now 6 months later. And in that time, we had been donated millions of dollars in software, and I'd been told that I would have the option to lead one of the foremost GIS labs in the world, following the World Health Organization and CDC, who had just finished mapping administrative 3 boundaries, so kind of like dioceses, for nations, in order to help track and measure Ebola. Now, you've all probably seen lots of COVID maps this year. Back at this time, as much as I want to say the Catholic Church was really far behind, actually the world wasn't really caught up with any of this yet. Nations in West Africa didn't have these boundaries of any sort digitized. And so I took this free flight, and I couldn't even afford to stay in a monastery in Rome. So I ended up in the 15 euro a night melting pot with all these hungover, smoky Euro trippers, sitting in a corner mapping the entire Vincentian family pro bono just to get an idea of the data structure of religious orders. Nobody wanted a map. Nobody even wanted a database. So we had to start off doing everything free and work our way up to this point, really, to build the interest and the market and the education in all of this. And now it's kind of, we're totally overwhelmed, which is fantastic. So there's me mapping the Vincentians, and then on the switchboard with the Vatican, calling and emailing and putting letters in the mail. And I hear back that Cardinal Turkson would like to meet, and also the Secretary of State, which was the most important meeting for this, because I thought, since there is no public map of dioceses, and I knew how powerful boundaries were, there must be some really compelling security reason why this isn't public. So if I don't want to waste resources with this amazing lab to make it in the first place, I also need to make sure that I'm doing it respectfully and responsibly. So these maps, I don't know how well you can see them, are on the 3rd loggia of the Apostolic Palace, where the Secretary of State is. And they're just the most amazing fresco maps. You get out of the elevator in this building. So this building is in the Vatican City. It's where Pope Francis lived, or where all the popes before Francis lived, until he decided to take more humble quarters in the Doma Santa Marta. And you just go down this, I thought I had almost maybe died and gone to cartographic heaven. Go down this hallway, and then you enter, and I don't have good photos of it, but you enter into this foyer with like 2 hemispheres of the world that are like gold-plated or silver-plated. And I sat down with the prelates, and I asked, can I speak with your cartographer? We don't have one. Geographer? They didn't have one. Okay. So I showed them the prototypes. I said, do you have these? Or is there any reason why I shouldn't make them? And they spoke in Italian for about 5 minutes as I sat there wondering, as a pretty recently confirmed Catholic, can you be excommunicated for asking a question? And the priest looked back at me and they said, why, yes, this would be useful for everything. And so I said, I'll be back, not really knowing where this would take me. And eventually I did return. In December 2016, after leading not only the team within the lab that had done the administrative boundaries for World Health, but also I had access up to 3,000 staff when I was at Esri. It was a crash course in management, and it was amazing. The experience was like nothing I could have gotten educationally anywhere. I met with geographers for nations and learned about geographic standards, really just kind of strange things that you don't usually think about unless you're deciding where to put Kosovo on a map or how to delineate a boundary. And we made these first global maps of the Catholic Church and premiered them in the Vatican at the Vatican Arts and Technology Council in December 2016. And in the summer of 2018, I was given permission by Pope Francis directly to establish a trial-run cartography institute in the Vatican, which I am currently renegotiating. So just to quickly overview, like, why am I here talking about maps when the thing is really property and land, right? Well, the reality is you can't really do planning of property in such a multivariate way without maps. For example, this is USCCP properties in relation to green infrastructure, so how they contribute to over 100 variables related to habitat connectivity, watershed health, soil quality. And that underlying data of our work is really valuable. Most people don't realize that just making that foundational data, that base map, is the most resource-intensive, time-intensive part of our work. Then we can bring together all these other kind of analyses that are often prepackaged from scientists around the world or companies to really integrate them into this base map. But the base map can cost anywhere from, if it's in good shape, and we're really lucky, just $100. But these projects can range wildly, up to even $50,000, $100,000, and if there's no land records for a country, over $1 million, which seems perhaps outrageous, but the benefits of that data are innumerable. Baseline property mapping and digitization alone, which has been, I would say, the vast majority of our work. Like I said, I had to start making maps for free. So eventually, we just started taking projects that would pay us anything at a certain point. So we did mapping for Catholic schools with a number of dioceses. We did financial analyses. We did, there's mentioned healthcare analyses and beyond. And no environmental requests ever came to us until this past year, which is really exciting. We've had to sneak in this work, well, not sneak in, but offer it pro bono, really, as a second thought to all of this. So it's really been system change work, the absolute grunt of digital transformation and ecological conversion in an implementable, informed way through a diocese. The baseline property maps are really valuable for a number of goals beyond our focus, so pastoral planning or healthcare management. Affordable housing is one of the projects that we have in our roster right now with an archdiocese. So it's being able to store that data well and stand up a system is really critical for any diocese we work with. All over the world, mapping is supporting NGO efforts as well. So I get requests from around the world, which we haven't been able to fulfill yet, but I'm hoping we'll get there. I believe it was the Gates Foundation when they were mapping for polio vaccine distribution in Nigeria. I have to double check the country, but I'm pretty sure it was Nigeria. Just by mapping the healthcare clinics, just by having people know where the system was and how to access it, infant mortality rates fell by almost half. If you can imagine just having these Catholic properties on a map could do amazing things for disaster response and further, which is why it's so critical to ensure that data is made in a kind of form and stored in a way that's accessible and updatable so we can make data work for good and multiply the impact of making land work for good. So I want to leave time for questions and don't want to go too deep into this, but how I ended up in the Vatican from that parish scale idea is really kind of this integrative approach that we've developed. Those global classifications drive what data and what analyses we bring to a diocese or a province. And the province scale data allows us to reapply these analyses that are really high resolution to sub-regional scales. So we can actually computationally analyze individual properties by the thousands. And that information then enables us to say, oh, this is the ideal site for solar restoration, or for tree planting. This is a great one. Tree planting without environmental awareness is a very bad solution. And I think everyone in ecology would agree with me on this. And it's a really big problem actually in NGOs around the world is sometimes you get these really simple canned solutions that are environmental but don't actually look at the environment. You have to plant the right tree in the right place, and it actually takes maintenance and care. So being able to look, say, at a diocese and being able to say, instead of this parish that is around a really lush area, right, that has drainage that goes into not some old combined sewer overflow, which means if there's too much rain, everything mixes together and goes out into some aquatic ecosystem. Being able to see, say, an inner city parish with tons of impervious surface, and being able to actually put stormwater management there versus the site where what we found the community isn't, generally impoverished. And they have, I don't want to call it luxury because environmentalism isn't a luxury, but they do have a luxury to think about this. Whereas in the middle of a city in a really hard-hit area, often thinking about stormwater management is the last thing you can do when you're just trying to get clothes on people's back and food in people's mouths. But the reality is where you put those environmental programs can have hundreds of times the impact on watershed health or a community's well-being. So the global scale, why we ended up there is really just the policy piece. And I'm hoping, I'm about to head to Europe for giving a TED Talk, being at COP, and back in the Vatican. So we'll see what happens. But the global scale of our work, why I interact with the Vatican at all still, I didn't turn down the Pope. I just proposed something that needed to happen. I should say that. Well, it was under research. I was offered $30,000 for a $1.2 million project. But the other piece is really that policy piece. I mentioned those geographers that I've met with. We made a piece of software to mine over 50 years of data from the Vatican Statistics Office, which was not in any digital form for the most part, that was not in dioceses this time. It was in countries. And that was hugely problematic. As a nation, they had Kosovo on the map. They didn't have any standards for countries that were disputed, like the boundary between India and Pakistan. And while this might not sound like a huge deal, actually, this kind of mistake from a cartographer or a nation's geography office can lead to political conflict, and actually even war. I know some cartographers that were contracted to do the nationwide standards initially for a country as they went through their digital transformation. They mislabeled Taiwan, and it was a mess. So the fact that the Vatican and the Holy See even posts any global maps related to anything Catholic without these standards is actually quite dangerous and irresponsible. And the fact that global Catholics, we don't have any standards for policy or security is really a big issue. So the Vatican Cartography Institute stands to kind of, I hope to go there and really stand this up if it's properly arranged to really bring in these experts and coordinate really getting this foundational work framework laid for all the departments there. We have requests coming in from multiple Vatican departments, and I've just stopped taking them because it would be really irresponsible without these standards. That information can also help Catholic Relief Services, Jesuit Refugee Services, any global Catholic religious order, any of us that are releasing maps. You know, being able to have these standards referenced will be a matter of global security for Catholics around the world. So that's a lot of data, that's a lot of policy. Individual religious orders will need their own policy and standards. We will have to get the diocesan boundaries in some sort of workflow to approve them. I don't have really concerns, like geopolitical boundaries are a little bit more, contestable, whereas with the diocese, I'm not very concerned about bishops arguing over turf, but you never know. We can just pray. So that data really feeds the diocesan scale, and I'm gonna, through classification, and the system that I mentioned, allowed us to classify like crisis dioceses. So we can see based on these predictive, or we could see, unfortunately, that program actually shut down. 3 weeks out, the number of migrants that were going to each diocese, the routes they were taking, 15 dread threat measures. So it mined over, this was a massive project. It was $80 million. We weren't involved. We don't have that kind of funding. But it was run, I mentioned Georgetown was involved, and it looked at people posting online, people talking and communicating online. It looked at, local newspapers, and it pulled out kind of not even direct measures, but more of a phenomenological sense of dread about human infectious disease, about plant disease, and about livestock disease, about religious conflict even, political conflict, and a number of other variables. So you can imagine that's really useful if we have that data, or one of our partners does. We don't sell data or actually keep it internally when we work with clients. We give it out to them to manage. They'll be able to respond with NGOs and relief services faster. So that creates a lot of data there through that kind of classification and knowing what's going on. And then at the really boots on the ground, because this is where it matters the most. Is this going to be another fancy platform or a tech solution? It's not. At the heart of everything is ecological conversion. these boots on the ground efforts. But as you can kind of, I hope, see, if you're doing a boots on the ground effort in your diocese, knowing where that's going to have the most impact can make a world of difference. Also, helping religious orders and dioceses manage their finances is going to be the only way to really make this, I would say, sustainable and long-term impactful, especially because these programs aren't necessarily cheap, or, you know, as laity become more involved in the church, there has to be new financial models, and our assets, our property assets, are trillions of dollars globally. There is no exact figure, and there is no exact figure for area. People always quote these numbers in articles with me. So I just want to put that out there. It is larger than France, but the exact number is unknown. So on this boots on the ground level, this is a project that I did for a regenerative farm. The thing is, it's really hard to categorize ecology and ecological programs like this because you're building community, you're educating, you're building health, you're building a future. This was for at-risk youth on a vacant property that was transformed. You're building food security, you're building ecosystem services, and all of this bare vacant lot, and to understand how to do this well requires making a lot of data, like a base map, utilities, parking, how are people gonna get there? Is it accessible by bus? What are the resources locally, the schools? What's the ecological context? What's the habitat connectivity? With tree canopy coverage? Who are the people of the place? Who's around there? How are you gonna make it accessible, and how are you gonna connect them with it, which is actually part of the design process. Always bringing people into the design process once you get, well, at the start for visioning, and then also once you get all this data so you can make informed decisions driven by them. The design is for the people and with the people. I consider myself almost a facilitator. Sight, light, I mean, you can't just plant a tree that won't grow in shade, in a shady space. I mean, we see this all the time. You don't want to plant a farm, like an urban farm on a place that was formerly a dry cleaning lot without a bunch of remediation, or raised beds with some precautions. It's really important to really just get this information, and it actually doesn't take that much training. It just takes time. And then once you actually do stuff, this is the planting plan that I made for a food forest and all this really fun stuff. That's also data. So you're getting data from how you're driving those decisions. And when I say data, I really mean you're collecting information and then you're making it into this accessible narrative that people can connect with and meet. Now on the site scale, I just showed you kind of how that works, the collection of it to create this narrative. But at a diocesan scale, what we've seen, actually this has been one of my favorite parts of my work, is you see different silos that would never talk to each other actually sitting at a table and having a conversation. The Laudato Si team can sit with the real estate team. That hasn't happened yet. I should say the affordable housing team can sit with the real estate team and Catholic Charities and the mayor's office for one day, and also with the diocesan fiscal team and the pastoral planning team, and make informed decisions together. And that's also really helpful for communities. What we've seen in especially the Northeast is parishes are closing and people are feeling lost and confused. By having a narrative and having a logic, you actually can help people in their faith by showing them how decisions were made. Now, you don't need to have everyone in the back room, every single parishioner in a diocese and every single Catholic and their brother, but it's really important that we're able to, justify what we're doing and also ground it in reality. So all of this information can kind of ideally feed back. We'll see where this goes. The spatial data infrastructure, which is mentioned, which is such a mouthful, and in the New Yorker, I believe I was quoted as saying it's very unsexy data infrastructure, but it's probably the most important thing we're doing, because you saw all of that data when we stand up one of those cloud-based systems for a diocese. The ideal is to stand up a kind of consortium first, so I can get this out at GoodLands, because it's way too much work for me. And it also is too powerful. So this would be a consortium that comes together and decides data standards, where the Holy See can have some executive oversight now that they have their governance in place. Where if you're a Jesuit province in East Africa doing agriculture mapping, this will allow you a consortium to actually get together and understand the security concerns. Land and data are super powerful for change, but like that kind of graphic earlier, also for conflict. I've met, over the years, I have been regularly attending State Department meetings, UN meetings, and becoming so aware of the struggles and courage of religious communities across the world, especially in fragile states. And it's really important, that kind of infrastructure, to hold this all. But to make land work for good, you have to make maps work for good. And I'm hopeful that we can also leverage that to really lead the Catholic Church with our most financially and politically powerful asset, aside from her people and all of us, into a more sustainable and verdant future. Thanks.
Thanks, Molly. We definitely have time for some questions from students. Just as we're beginning, though, I'm wondering what kind of surprises you found as you were doing this research. So, is there something that you learned specifically about the U.S. or about the Northeast or about the world, like in the data that you're finding? Was there something just really interesting?
Well, the first big surprise, which I kind of touched on, was like the lack of data. Complete barren landscape for data. I actually, I remember when we started, so I'm not going to pull up the graphic unless, here, I'll turn this off so I can be here. There was a graphic for provinces. That was the only global map of the Catholic Church, right? But this is 2014. And it was made in GIMP, which is open source like Photoshop. So it wasn't a data map. It was pretty much a digital drawing. And it was flat, and it was made by an 18-year-old at University of Chicago who was our first hired intern. Actually, we never had any unpaid interns, and I got paid less than our interns. So, and we all were paid nothing, practically. But yeah, so I brought him on board, actually, with the Esri team, which was awesome. But the other thing was the Atlas Hierarchicus, which is subnational, and it's hand-drawn, and it was updated in 1901. So what that means is there was no global map of the church, truly, unless you want to count the provinces. But that one is, because it's in all these different projections, it's pretty much a fancy doodle. So I guess that was just shocking. The fact that a nation doesn't have a geographer was shocking. I would say the actual data itself, the pre-shortage crisis really hit me. Because when you're doing analyses with data, we had to make these boundaries. I don't think people realize how massive a project that was. That was a project of over 20 people, pretty much, night and day, working on that, in addition to those 3,000 staff that we could bring in when we needed. And so you're doing that, and then David Cheney, who I don't know about his personal life, but I call him the patron saint of data management. He runs Catholic Hierarchy. We worked, and we still work with him on his data, which is in a very archaic form of a database because he's just funding it all on his own, and I keep trying to get support for him. But it's, so that means it's thank God we have a lot of kind of older tech people, actually, access to them, because they were the only ones that knew what to do with it. But so you clean the data, and then we put it into the map, and it was, all of a sudden we're seeing the Catholic Church. It was crazy. And the pre-shortage, I actually had to step out and call my friend, who was the Superior General for the Congregation of Mission, the Vincentians, because I was so upset. It was so bad. We hear about how bad it is in the US. All of a sudden I'm seeing one priest for every 25,000 Catholics in many parts of the world. And of course, thankfully, my friend was he had done mission work in China and Panama, all over, and we figure it out. It'll be fine. He helped calm me down, but that was a hard shock, I would say. What else has been really interesting? Changes in sisters. Well, I guess that it was kind of predictable going up in India and down in other places. The Catholic population globally isn't going down like it is in the Northeast United States or, Western Europe. There's a lot of areas where it's actually rapidly increasing. any other data, well, the climate data, but putting that in diocese made it just, I was like, oh my gosh, there go half the Catholic population in 20 years if we don't do something. Yeah, most places where the Catholic Church is growing are actually at massive risk for deadly heat waves and the worst impacts of climate change. So yeah, that was like, seeing those two sets together was a lot.
Hello, thank you for being here and for speaking with us. I just wanted to ask, so I'm a law student here at Yale, but one of my kind of side interests is urban policy and planning. So I'm just curious, have you employed any lawyers or interacted with them? And, just wanting to hear a bit more about those experiences.
Yes, that's actually a really good question. We've started to have actually non-Catholic entities reach out to us, including governments, municipalities that want to make their land work for good. So we're trying to, when I say we, GoodLands is me, and I'm serious, and a gaggle of 1099 contractors we can spin up. With a salary of less than a McDonald's manager, and millions of dollars in pro bono resources. So we have a massive team of lawyers at Weil, obviously, because doing anything requires legal support. We also have like very specific niche lawyers for social enterprise management through various academic institutions, and land is a huge, like, we don't do the legal, say if we see a conservation easement should go somewhere. The good thing is we can show where that should go. Local Nature Conservancy can put it on. And if anyone wants to ask about the business model there of why the Nature Conservancy just can't, part of it deals with the fact that conservation does not have a business model that supports any organization that's not paying tax on their land. So we had to figure one out. But yeah, for the policy making, actually I was invited over to the British Commonwealth, and I actually gave a talk. It was in a class, it wasn't like one of those big lectures at the Harvard Government School. And there's been a lot of interest in my work as showing pretty much a model for meta-state or post-nation state governance. Like, oh my gosh, the Catholic Church is ahead of something really radical that we didn't even know about. But it really is. We're a hidden India of 1.3 billion people unified under canon law, under ecclesiastical law in many senses, and under also, unified by kind of Catholic social teaching and a moral compulsion. So it's a very, the kind of meta-state view has been very interesting to multiple governments and operations. It's kind of interesting to look at it that way too, because we're pretty much the biggest organized. we are organized-ish. We're getting there. But transnational non-state actor or even state actor, across boundaries. And if you think about that, the Catholic Church we have a critical role to play in the impacts of climate change across borders, in our service ministries, because social unrest, especially political tensions, are really going to rise with migration. And climate and environment don't conform to diocese, but they also don't conform to geopolitical boundaries. A watershed will cross many boundaries. And so having the distributed network we have is like really awesome. Yeah, I don't know if that answers it. Stephen Goldsmith, I don't know if he's still at the Kennedy School, but he has really, and Governor Murphy are both really good to look at for geo-governance with data.
I know many of your most recent awards were actually not from the Catholic side of things. So I'm curious, just like, who are the people that maybe you're working alongside with that are really inspiring, or who are the other people that we should be paying attention to in terms of the environmental world, or people who are working for similar kinds of causes?
So National Geographic Explorer, which is really cool. Oh my gosh, it's like the coolest club to be a part of. People are like running off and like gathering like lemur poop and like testing manatee DNA. It's like, and then I'm like the weird one with Catholic maps, but They welcome me. Yeah, there's so much good happening out there, to be honest. You know, when I think about some of the efforts, I think actually of Dorothy Stang, who was a religious sister, Catholic, who was a land activist who was murdered. Really sadly, these numbers are going up a lot. Land, trillions of dollars in assets. But the indigenous people that I've met have really been, you know, absolutely towing the line as earth defenders in many parts of the world, where biodiversity is most critical for supporting systems that we couldn't rebuild in another millennia, you know, or even imagine. And Pope Francis has thankfully done a lot to reach out. Of course, this summer we saw with the indigenous schools, which we have all these projects in our pipeline and we can't take any of them right now because of capacity. But some of them do deal with religious orders and dioceses reaching out to us about reconciliation. And I'm actually really hopeful that a kind of approach with maps and land can allow us to meet on common ground and really regenerate while we make reparations for these really dark, egregious pasts that are just the Catholic Church really messed up. Not as a whole. We all know that there's good and bad people, but as a whole, we should own our mistakes. Who else is awesome? Gosh, Jane Goodall. Well, every time I see her, she asks me about birth control, though. I get this all the time because I'm the only Catholic environmental woman, and for some reason, people think it's fine to ask me about population control and birth control. And I always just tell them to go get mapping software. It won't even be a concern. But yeah, I would say actually Paul Farmer, which is strange because he's a doctor, you know, Partners in Health. But one of the big issues that we face, which I mentioned, the scalability, is still cost effectiveness. You know, we were reached out to recently by a diocese in Southeast Africa, and a number of bishops that want to do mapping with us and working with a local major Catholic NGO. And what we can do for, you know, a diocese in the U.S., they can't necessarily afford, but there's so much talent, you know, and local talent in places. So I've been really kind of, you know, diving into how he and his organization managed to bring in people who had super kind of intense specialized education that required a lot of time and unique experience in a domain and to build up local capacity that builds up both the economy and the people. So that's what I've been he's been in his work, and similar programs have really been on my mind for the ability to make things scalable and more affordable, but also to leverage the talents and gifts of local people.
It really seems like your work is part of your vocation and that you're using these God-given passions and talents to do good and to seek holiness. And I just wonder how your work has impacted your spiritual life and your own relationship with God.
Well, working for the Catholic Church is hard. No, I shouldn't say that. It's interesting because I got confirmed in college and really came back to the church then. And the land thread has been through my entire life. So before, you know, I was co-founding my first company, I was kind of punk. I don't know if I can really own that. But yeah, I knew these, we were all just kind of misfits, and the kid from the front of my algebra class where I was accelerated and he was decelerated, he's actually quoted in the New York Times saying that he was trying to get just one GPA above failing every semester for all of his classes. He and a bunch of people squatted this mansion in Buffalo. Buffalo is full of vacant old buildings, and it's developing a bit more, but when I was growing up, they had a homesteading program where you could get a house for $1. And our playgrounds were old industrial buildings, which is probably something I'll regret when I'm older, if the planet isn't on fire, maybe. God knows what I was exposed to there. But yeah, so I grew up with this vast landscape of vacant spaces. That was where I grew up, and these kind of like rad kids. I found we were all kind of like misfits, and I was not impressed at all with religion or society or education or pretty much anything. So I actually thought if I was going to be a Catholic, when I first started to like move in the direction, I thought I would be like a very Peter Morin type, which I still kind of am sometimes, because I do stay with religious communities when I travel, but it's awesome. Even if I had, you know, all the support in the world to stay in the nicest place, I would still stay with them because it is a vocation, and I learned so much about property from the people I'm with. Ignatian discernment, like really, St. Ignatius's examen was like, if I hadn't gotten my college degree, if I just walked out with the examen in spiritual direction, it would have been worth it. Like that's how important it is. And it's really listening to the, I would say, to the quiet voice of God in your heart. Because there's so much. You know, I set out, so there was the like scrappy, I was at Occupy actually. I remember, I had a sign that said, we're the 100%, we can make it better together, and I almost got chewed out by a Marxist bro. But I moved towards the kind of social entrepreneurial space, and then towards this, oh my gosh, I don't even know, it's massive. I mean, we do have a social enterprise business model, but there's no finance, period. I would say for anything environment. So I mentioned I have like a McDonald's salary. Like if you go into this, it has to be a vocation. Like the St. Cattery Conservation Program has a 4-figure budget. And they're the only ones in the United States towing the line between the right-wing Catholics and ecology and indigenous land with their communications. I mean, it's the whole space is just, but discernment's really important. I would say how it's changed my faith is I was never like, I had a very stubborn conversion. Like I took Greek for 2 years and argued the Nicene Creed all the way through with Jesuits until I lost the argument. I was like, wow, I'm Catholic. This is awesome, kind of. I don't know, but it is awesome. And it's the best thing that happened to me. But I was never disillusioned. And the Pope, it's so interesting because, you know, when you meet the Pope, the first time I was like, oh my gosh, this is going to be this holy moment. Every time I've met him, it's always like, man, your cataracts look a little bit worse. And like, he's so human. And I think that that's been one of the surprises is, and maybe it's because I kind of got so disenchanted with authority that like, when I step back and I look at, say, his work or even me, I never aimed for success. If anything, I wanted to be a farmer nun at the start, and I just kept going, okay, sure, God, whatever you want. And it took a lot more courage. And I think I am a lot more fulfilled. I think I would have felt I was missing something just doing that site scale. But it's a lot of courage. I didn't realize how much courage is a part of yesing to God. I mean, my senior year, I turned down going to Rome. Actually, that was the first time I turned down Rome, to work with a world-famous artist and going to this little school that no one had heard of for ecological design. I mean, and the success for me has actually been like more of a scary thing, like than celebrating, which is kind of strange. But yeah, and I think that's the most challenging because part of you's like with this kind of humble Christian. You know, it's humbling because you know that the person you see on the street is you're here to serve them and they're above you. But the world gets weird about success around you. So I don't know. It's been interesting. I feel like God's like become a friend a lot. And I got a very Marian year, finally. Like I've had struggled with the Mary relationship, and like this year, it's been awesome.
Hi. I have a multi-layered question that I hope that your multi-layered maps can answer. Given that the environmental crisis that we face is the result of many generations of activity, And given also that the lands that the Catholic Church holds, for the most part, are a result of many generations of colonial appropriation. What do your maps show, or can they show, in terms of distribution of responsibility within the Catholic Church?
That's a really good, really hard question that we've been grappling with a lot. I think it's less what our maps can show and more what they can facilitate as far as this goes. So we've clearly messed up in this. Think of land like a palimpsest. You know what a palimpsest is? Like vellum that people used to like write over and then kind of get the ghost of the old writing on it. And so think of land as a palimpsest of all of our pasts. And the maps, I think, can help facilitate much needed reconciliation, also financial management for dioceses, dealing with, say, reconciliation, financial repayments to communities in a way that the worst thing that could happen, I'm gonna have an angry mob coming after me after I say this, the worst thing that could happen would be no one's looking and all of this goes away to developers, right? And that's what's happening in places like the United States. So what we really want to see is really intelligent asset collateralization, partnerships. We need to get that baseline. We know what we have before we can really talk about reconciliation and moving this process forward intelligently. Because right now it's just this, so often it's like this haphazard, like, oh my gosh, this is up for sale, we'll just sell that, we'll do that, we'll do that. And oftentimes they even go well below market value, we found. So it's just knowing will enable both the financial piece of it, but also for people to meet on the land. I think we're in such, if you just read that last climate report, like, it's not even just my faith, I would say, that allowed me to have courage to do this, but the reality is we're in a crazy crisis situation. Like, it is the end of the world as we know it, or it's the end of the world, and the climate crisis has been here. Millions, 7 million people a year die from air pollution. So I think it's really important to know what we have so that we can ensure that we come together and heal the earth and meet on common ground and heal each other. Without that space, there's no environment left. Should I end on a happier note?
Do you have a happy note to end on?
Wait. Well, there's the resurrection, right? No pressure.
Well, I thank you so much for joining us tonight, and thank you to everybody for being with us. Have a good night, everybody.